All right, so let's pick up with the next year. We finished this slide on parts of a syllabus and we get to action. The way that I ask you to think about this is what is actually happening in your program. Now, you will tend to use the word movement because of action. Movement is not just physical, movement is intellectual, it is social. So the Jesus movement was a 5th century description of Christianity that has come back into vogue once again. The Jesus movement. Movement of the heart, movement of the mind, movement of the soul. So if we are talking about planning out an educational offering, how, where, all right? I want to ask the hows and wheres of life, though. I want to ask how we are approaching information that will affect a change. If you are the same exact person when you walk out that door as when you walked in this door, you have not learned anything. There has to be change. There has to be some new information you're carrying out, or some change in emotion, or some change in knowledge base, or whatever it is. There has to be a change. And that is action. So I ask what changes the learner should experience. If it is in a Sunday school, I taught, I forget how many weeks it was, 8 weeks I think. I did a series on Revelation. And interesting how many people were like, oh really? You're doing the R word. The R word? Yet by the end of it, people weren't thinking of it as the R word, they were thinking about it as it is. The most loving and worshipful book in the entire Bible. I actually made a group of them. I gave them homework, which Sunday school you don't normally give homework. I made them go through the hymnal that they were using and look at how many of the hymns that were in the hymnal were directly out of the book of Revelation. And so many people ask, what book are you using for it? Excuse me? What book? Is it the one by Billy Bob or the one by Dr. So-and-so? Said, no, it's the revelation of Jesus Christ according to John.
Number 66, that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. But that's a change, because all of a sudden they started opening up and going, what is this thing? What should the learner experience? And if they are analyzing hymns and realizing how worshipful the book is, they forget about, oh, the locust monster things that killed this much. God has his hand over the smite button for humanity, but doesn't push it. So all of a sudden they start to go, oh, wait, this is not scary, this is hopeful. That's change. That's amazing change. That all of a sudden, this book that Martin Luther said, I can't find Christ in, you realize, Martin, I love you, but you're a dummy. And you can start to go through it. What do these changes mean to the learners, though? Do they see why it is good for them to embrace and open themselves up to the love of Christ? Can they understand what that means? If you go into your average inner city church, just like your average rural church, it's weird how close the parallels are. People don't always understand the love of God for a very long time, because the societies don't always show love, and we don't talk about love. There is a song on the radio right now, now considered an older song because it's several years old, where this gentleman sings that he is into having sex, not into making love. It's part of the objectification of humanity. That this person is singing about love as a detriment to humanity. It should be all about having pleasure, me having pleasure. You, maybe. Maybe. If it can increase my pleasure, great, that's it. So they can't always understand love. If there is great need, there's economic disenfranchisement, stuff like that, it's difficult for them to conceive of love. So often, not always. Some of the most loving churches I've ever seen are in downtown of major cities or in the middle of nowhere. But statistically speaking, back to that normal curve, those are the churches that tend to have to preach hellfire and damnation, that church is just fire insurance. Keep you out of the fires of hell. Instead of winsome grace. What a reformed idea. And then, for me, enabling learning is asking the question, how is God glorified by this educational offering? Should be planned out. Should be planned out. If you are teaching a course, like you're teaching on Revelation, and you're teaching that course and you are not consciously thinking beforehand, how is God glorified? And I'm not talking about by them knowing the fullness of Scripture. That's an easy get out of jail free kind of stupid answer. That's not the real answer. That's trite. The meaningful answer. How are they fitting into their lives? How are they developing their personal piety? How are they thinking about their prayer life, their relationship with God? And if I'm not considering that, how God is glorified by every educational offering, even whittling. How is God glorified in whittling? That this young person now understands and they can relate and they can understand about what graven images are, and they can also understand how to use things, how to respect, why are there injunctions against ingesting other people's blood, stuff like that. But you cut yourself, and it opens up a possibility. I don't want them to cut themselves, but if they do, we're going to have a talk about it. That's important, so that God is glorified. The actions also have to be the expectations. You have several actions that lead into assessments. Are you taking other actions that I'm not assessing during this course?
Yes.
Give me an example. Any of it.
I'm writing things down that you don't know about. I'm sharing it with others. And actually, everything I learn, my wife learns also to some extent because she types my papers. I've even asked some professors what I do to get my wife's name on this degree too. It's being shared, not intentionally, but it's getting shared. And she in turn shares that.
Mm-hmm.
She teaches DUI school, so it's getting shared all over the place.
Yeah. What about you guys?
I honestly don't know what all you're paying attention to, so
Hopefully not everything.
there may be more informal syllabi than we will ever know.
There are. I keep putting down. Bobby checked his phone 6 times during wife and kids. Becca's gonna text you occasionally, I get it. Sometimes they're important. In an undergrad, you know how I am draconian about this phone, but this is different. What? Go ahead.
Kind of picking up back on what Joe said, how we transmit this information that we learn here to other people. But then kind of going back to the whole, your example of how it affects our thinking and our prayer life and our worship. And we're all called to be ministers of some sort, so in practice, you're not there when I give a chapel in Edgefield, so you can't assess how I put this theory into practice. I mean, I can write down on paper or something like that, but you don't see me actually doing it, so you can't.
But what do I see based on that?
The questions that we bring back after trying this and our trial and error outside of the seminary, and then bringing those new experiences into this class and how that shapes our thinking with the new information we get.
Yeah. And sometimes I see it in confidence.
Okay.
At the end of a semester, when you hear the subtle issues and you see that students are holding themselves in higher regard, that's better than any test or paper that I can give you. If you come back and say something that I have to stop and think, okay, that's where the armory is. So someone was so happy that they walked out and they walked to the left all the way down to the bridge and back to the armory. Okay, now I get that. That would be because of the work that you were doing in your several classes. So even if it's this integrating into those, right?
Right.
You think that you're the only one teaching that person, even if it's the only course they're taking, you're missing part of the point. Don't take credit for stuff you're not doing. Psalm 115, I love it in Latin, honestly, because when I learned Latin, that was one of the few things they were allowed to use church stuff. Non nobis domine, non nobis. Not for us, Lord, not for us, but for your name be glory given. It's fabulous. It just sounds cool in Latin. You start thinking about the integration of all of these components. All right. When I am putting together a syllabus for anything, even a church bulletin, I stop and think, what is this going to cost? And it might be something practical like, oh, I want a color picture on the front so that they're thinking about the blood of Christ. Oh, the sanguinephilia of the Reformed Church. Hemophilia is already taken, so we use the Latin derivative of sanguinephilia. How many songs about the blood, oh the blood, instead of, oh the glory of the ascension, the resurrection. We don't have many songs about that. It's not as gory. So I have to think of the cost of time, money, resources. What is the cost of community impact? I will sometimes work with business owners because the employees want a Bible study, and we have a Bible study. How do you do it at work so that it's not decreasing productivity? That is a cost. But how do you balance it out so that there is an increased productivity for the business owner because people are thinking through the power of the gospel, even if it's during their lunchtime or whatever, and then they are being more productive in some way, shape, or form. And it's not always how many widgets they produce, it's how they produce them or how they get along, how fewer number of days that they're missing due to illness because they're living a better life. All of that is an aspect of cost. Now, we get into assessment, and this is the big question. How do you know what learners have actually learned? And it's not always the formal educational things of a paper or a test or whatever examination. It is sometimes the later reflection that you learn about years later. I still talk to students that I taught 22 years ago, and they still tell me, I still remember this or I still remember that. 2 years ago, I wrote an email to a guy named Michael Salemi. He was my economics professor in undergraduate. And I still remember some of his lectures. Never went into economics. But I thought it important to share with him. I still remember about marginal propensity to consume and what an MPC curve is and what it does, because his lectures were so brilliant and amazing. I did not do that well in his course. But that he was that good, I thought I should share. And he's getting ready to retire, and he's like, I can't thank you enough, because sometimes I wonder, was this worthwhile to do all these years, other than making a lot of money off of writing books? What is the impact? To see older preachers hear from families, Grandpa had to move to that retirement home in this other state where my sister could take care of him, but he always talked about your sermons and how it helped him be calm and face mortality with excited and happy anticipation. It's not death, it's commencement of the full life. That's pretty impressive. That's a part of assessment too. So we have to make sure that we're not thinking only on immediate change that we can put a test and a number to. It's not just the quantifiable, it's the qualifiable. So I sometimes ask you guys weird questions before or after class or during class. Are you using any of this? Is this helping you make sense of the work that you're doing in your church or in whatever context you're living in? That's why I do that, because that's part of assessment. And if we don't, you don't just glad hand people as they're leaving church after your sermon to hear, "Oh, that was mighty good, Pastor." Yeah, it's nice for your ego. But if you're not asking them the questions to understand, keep talking about, we listen to understand or we listen to respond. Listening to respond is egocentric and can be destructive. Listening to understand makes you so much better a teacher or a preacher. It's hard sometimes because you want to share something important with your life. But sometimes if you do, it degrades what they're trying to tell you. And then you're not ministering the gospel to people. You're not curing their souls. Remember, cure as in curate, not as in heal, right? Okay. Relatable to objectives and purposes. If it's a formal assessment, it better be able to relate. If you look on the syllabus, it tells you exactly what learning objectives are satisfied by those assessments, so that I am making sure. And then what are the limits? Are there times, hopefully you're going to say yes, that you learned more 5 years after you took a course than when you were taking that course?
Yes.
Yeah. That's real learning. How do we assess that though?
Our ease with which we talk about it or share it, our understanding of it. Look, I could shoot when I was 12 years old, but I didn't know the intricacies of it until much later. See, now that's got to do with the Bible, not the Marine Corps. So, yeah.
Bible, Marine Corps, what's the difference, right? All right, we go through here, and I just put in a couple of questions for you to really think through about observing. Two things you might notice about when I am teaching, I try really hard. It's rare I look at the screen. If I do, I'm tending to be pointing to something, and I'm looking to make sure I'm pointing at the right thing. I'm spending the rest of my time looking at you. I should be looking partly at this camera since I'm recording it too, because otherwise it's kind of discounting future learners who are watching this. Sorry. But if I'm not watching you, am I seeing where you're having difficulty? Am I seeing when you're going, I don't know about that? Follow through your own facial expressions. And if you trace back when I've made a change or reiterated a point with slightly different perspective, that's why, right? Have you ever been up in a pulpit and you've seen people who are like, I did 6 weeks, I think it was 8 weeks, down in Troy ARP Church for John Paul. And I had his pulpit and I taught on 1 John, and oh, what a great experience. He said, now, if Mr. So-and-so looks at his watch, say, amen, you're done. If anyone else starts looking at their watch, wrap it up. But if he looks at his watch, amen, you're done, okay? Great. 20 minutes the most you can go, okay. One day, I preached for 45 minutes, and Mr. So-and-so actually came up and said, I could have listened to you for another 2 hours on this topic. Why? It resonated with him that day. Open yourself up. Make sure that you're allowing the Holy Spirit to do His work. Don't be on your hobby horse. I could not tell you what I said. I wish I could. I wish I had recorded it. It must have been brilliant, but it wasn't mine. That's for sure. I had prepared really well, but not that well. And that's part of it. But when I am teaching, when I am preaching, I'm looking at the learners. Because just looking at my notes, yeah, I check where I am, but I don't have my glasses on. I can just see there's some red writing there and I have blue things underneath it. That's all I can see. I can't focus on it otherwise. Start thinking through that a little more. Now, there were 3 readings for this week that we need to touch on, and I really want us to put them into a slightly different context than just the alphabetical offerings, all right? I want you to think about this because it is most salient for you right now. This fostering community. I almost said a really good new word.
I would have written it down if you did.
This basic idea, how do we help someone who is in a seminary class to really grapple a little bit with their education? How do we foster so that the 4 of you and then future learners who are watching this video as part of an EVC course, that you form community by listening to one another and challenging one another and really delving into examples of learning. Examples of learning. Stop and think. Does it form community more for you guys to do a group project? Yes. Does it always form it perfectly? No. But are you forced to interact and recognize what are the strengths and limitations of your partners in community in the classroom? Do you learn more when it is opened up for discussion? And you share perspective. I learn from all of you every class that I don't talk too much, and I do open it up for discussion. I learn a tremendous amount because it's community. So we go through here and we have to be conscious. We have to think about it. How much time am I building in? And I try and keep that in the back of my mind. But then, how do we foster things? Do we plan on things to talk about at the coffee pot? No. Why not? It's like the 5th time I've asked the same question, just in a totally different way. Why don't we plan out what we talk about at the coffee pot?
That's not how informal education works.
Yeah. It's limiting the informal. It's limiting you bringing your experiences and the salience of what we have just talked about in a new way. But you can't avoid that we will eventually get to the stuff we were just talking about because it has inspired other thoughts. It's called a cascade effect. And yes, sometimes other issues of daily life are going to come into play. Great. But they're going to be seen through this new lens of what we have been discussing if we are effective in teaching. So Sue puts this rail fence model of learning. And I want you to think about this in your church. I want you to think of this almost as a coffee hour model of education. All right? There's fence posts here. Sharing, discussion, and reflection. Do you really honestly have an opportunity for reflection during coffee hour? No. Sharing and discussion are actually even debatable. Are there times where you need to not share because someone else has to? Because that's part of teaching or part of your ministerial load. And you really want to talk about something. But sometimes you really can't because you recognize someone else has to share. It might not be at that coffee hour that you get to discuss. So this fence post, if we have the best of all possible worlds, we would have our sharing, Then we discuss the sharing, and then you go home and reflect on it. Or we give you some writing time, and then we come together and share that again, as if sharing is the next post, and then more discussion, and then more reflection. And then we build a fence all the way around something other than the altar. We really start considering that education is an iterative process. There are many iterations, and we will reiterate the different components of it again and again. What else did you get from this community building?
I brought into it just because of my 2 CPE internships. And one thing I really struggled with was doing ministry in a community of ministers. I mean, the floor is mine. I'm the chaplain for that floor.
Mm-hmm.
But if something's not happening right up there, I'm personally, I like to sit down. I do it all the time. I go in the family room, especially if no one was there, and I would think about what's going wrong and how do I fix it. And then from there, I'd go out back into the floor and try to fix it. And my final evaluation, my supervisor brought it up how I don't bring my problems back into the group to discuss, or to share and discuss and go back, try something new, and reflect on things. So seeing how much smarter that is and how much more productive that is for me to learn that way, education-wise, I thought that was pretty smart. Just making it so simple for me to, so obviously it's, would be a better model than me just trying to figure it out on my own, just trying to shoot from the hip. So that was helpful. And also I was thinking just the idea of group meals and whatnot, and building that community, and how biblical that really is.
Yes.
I mean, Christ and Zacchaeus, I mean, he's like, I'm going to go eat with you today.
Yeah.
And how community-oriented Jesus really was and is, and how the gospel isn't. I think, especially in the Baptist church, we make salvation and we make the gospel so individualistic, and we miss the idea of the church. And when you look at the Bible through covenant lens, it never has it been just you. It's always the church and the body of Christ.
Yep.
And so I was really struck with how biblical it really is to build that community among learners. And I was thinking also for the professors or for the teachers to have other teachers to lean on. And then if something's not going right when you're teaching in education, you bring that back to other educators. And how it's a two-way street. It's not just for to build a group for the learners, but also have a group of teachers for the teacher.
Yep.
I hadn't thought about that either. Christ sometimes is going to say something in a very, this is how it is kind of fashion, but oftentimes, maybe more often than the other, he's asking probing questions to get somebody to give him the answer that he wants. And then his ability to delegate out to his, 3 or 12 or 70 is so different than what we see in church leadership at times, where the person, I love what, I remember, he quoted somebody, and I don't know who he quoted, so me having source amnesia of
That's okay.
something, but being the guy by the side, not the sage on the stage.
That was actually, he miscites it, that was actually Rosemary Caffarella who said that.
See, so I didn't have source amnesia, I just knew he was wrong.
He says it was an MBA brochure from Singapore, is the way he put it in the article. And I almost sent that to Rosemary, that her stuff and her saying is being used 40 years later in Singapore and in...
But I like that, it's even right now in my position at the church I'm at, I'm the Christian program particular Sunday school or this thing, because they want me to be able to sort of manage and organize and coordinate a lot of different things.
That's actually what this is about.
But one of the things I see in the way that it's teaching is it's very, one person is in front of a row of chairs saying what they think, or even just reading what has been given them as their curriculum. And I want to get into a classroom and almost just build a test case of, what goes on when we circle the chairs and facilitate discussion.
Yeah.
I mean, we get a sermon, we're gonna have programming, and there's lots of places where you can input more information if you're interested, but rarely, maybe not rarely, but not often enough do people just sit down and talk about these things.
Have you ever heard of the yeshiva model of discussion? So yeshiva university, it's like the Jewish Harvard effectively here in this country. Yeshiva is a very old word for school, basically, from your Hebrew. But the yeshiva model of instruction says that sometimes you need to grab the napkin and break the bread, which means they sit down at a table, not necessarily for a meal, but to have bread as a distraction. And it winds up fitting in, and all of a sudden you learn a little bit more about the Eucharist. And it's communion without being holy communion, but its intentional nature makes it a holy event. Careful about our terms here. So the yeshiva model says we should sit around that round table, or octagonal table for 8. You take a napkin, you grab a loaf of bread, you break off your piece, hand it to the next person. Why the napkin? So that we're not imposing ourselves on the bread. We're letting the bread speak for itself and be a part of it. It's part of their heritage, and it's a cool, weird thing when people stop and think, oh, it's better sanitation. Yeah, you think it's better sanitation. That's all you think. And then let them fill in. So the bread, it's not saying this is a substitute for Eucharist by any stretch, but it's giving us a bit of distraction so that we can use the bread to silence ourselves at times.
The term they use about pregnant silence.
That's
I love, one of my things is, people get very uncomfortable when they say something in a class context, and then people are quiet. And then they feel like they've failed somehow because people didn't either erupt in applause or have the answer to their question or comment on what they said.
Yeah.
But sometimes you just got their wheels turning, and especially when they're not used to discussion in a classroom setting, that awkward silence, if you think of it as a pregnant silence and you just give it some time to fester and germinate, then your follow-up question, or if you just wait them out, somebody's gonna break the awkward silence eventually.
Yeah. What you thinking, Joe?
I thought the whole thing made me think that I need to ask more probing questions and listen more than talk more. And that way I can get a better feel of what they're thinking, where they're coming from, and how better to deal with it, and then go from that question, the probing question, and then let them open themselves up and go, okay, I feel like, I'm going, and why do you feel that way, and what makes you say that, and it comes up in a psychiatrist or something from TV, Bob Newhart show. He had his own TV show years ago, guys.
I know the dog are too.
Well, you got me TV at home? Because I don't do that, I end up, a lot of times unintentionally, but interjecting, like especially with drug and alcohol class, and saying, you know what? And I never would have felt that way. Back when I was drinking, here's what it was, and, we went over what special occasions might tempt you that are coming up. Birthdays, holidays, camping trips, family reunions, whatever. And then I said that what tempted me was to drink was any day that ended in a Y. And any time on the clock that ended in o'clock. That was my time, so. And I do it sometimes and in some of the classes, and other ones, it ends up seeming like it's more about me. find out more about where they're coming from and their cultural beliefs and how they were raised. Were you raised in the mountains? No, I was raised in Chicago. I was raised in Cleveland, Georgia, and I can find out a little bit more about where they're coming from and why they do the things they do, and better ways to reach them.
And it's funny that both what you and Bobby just said actually fall right into this, the discussion of how and when. When do you open? When do you ask a probing question? And when do you just go ahead and stream of consciousness unload what you think they need to hear? Those are all acceptable at different times.
Well, and sometimes it is, because that gets other people to open up and go, oh, I didn't know where
No.
you'd been where we are. Sometimes it's just, yeah, I've never had a drink in my life, and you can do it too, and we don't get anything out of those people.
Right.
But another drunk like you, yeah, we can talk to you all day.
Yeah, it's funny because when I work with colleagues on this, and I tell them one of my greatest struggles in teaching a course like this is that I can't always employ the methods that I'm teaching, because there is so much content that the 3 hours a week does not have enough time to get into it. This is the one required Christian Ed course, and we have not offered any Christian Ed courses in a while. So all of a sudden we have to start to discuss what's been missing from our curriculum in order to get you to be better teachers. And we say, oh, well, the culprit in homiletics. Hopefully you're already thinking, wow, this should have been in my homiletics course. But the homiletics course has also got so much direct content at times we can't do these best practices.
And oftentimes homiletics as a course in seminary is very much geared towards preaching, and facilitating discussion in a classroom setting are two very different experiences. Or at
Exactly.
least I think they should be.
But then again, honestly, we were talking about at some of the other churches that I've preached at recently, and one, I was in the middle of my sermon and I was on my little rock and roll path, and yeah, it was wonderful. And then someone actually goes, I have a question about that. And I loved it, because that's what I try and get students to do over at the college every day. But in church, I was taken aback a tiny bit, and I loved it, but I was still taken aback. And it changed, and I think it made it into one of the best sermons I've ever given.
This was during a sermon?
During a sermon.
I've had that happen one time, and I just thought, that is weird. This isn't Sunday school. You don't ask questions here. But then again, I kind of liked it, so.
We see a lot of scriptural examples of people interrupting teaching and sermons with questions. And usually those are the profound moments. And I usually take it as it was worthy of putting down, because that's when the Spirit had activity. So I don't mind it in the middle of a sermon. I don't write manuscripts for sermons. And if I don't know what I'm talking about well enough to go without a manuscript or even these notes, I don't really belong teaching or preaching. The only thing I will rely on, I will never quote scripture out of a Bible in a sermon or in a class. I will grab that Bible and read it to you, because I'm not arrogant enough to want to show off that I have memorized something. I'll relate it loosely, I'll paraphrase it. But if I'm going to go for word, I'm going to read it directly out of there, because it has to be about that word, not about me. And we're trying to steal attention from God by showing how brilliant we are remembering. That's an important difference in teaching. That's where our decisions, are we coaching? Are we being didactic? Are we being Socratic? Those are the decisions. How much pause? How much space? And I think Sue really gets us into this discussion well. Our ideas of why, the types of teaching. Notice the goals and means difference here. And I don't remember what page this is in Sue, but it's table 1. So you can open that up, and that's a good place to highlight. In my copy of it, I just took a highlighter and circled the whole table. All right, anything else on Sue? Otherwise, let's go off here to this question of disability. Now, did you notice that this is coming from one perspective? In which case, tell me what one perspective this entire article is coming from. And yes, it is a study, sort of. It's not really a study, it's a simple survey, which I have a problem with. It's not a study then, it's a survey. A study goes beyond a survey.
I just looked at it as a way to be more conscious of who I'm talking with, who I'm dealing with, how to deal with them, how to help them, is the way I approached it when I was reading and what I ended up getting out of it.
Well, I'm sorry, what was the question?
What is the one perspective that this entire article is from? It's from a very particular perspective. It's not discussing all aspects of disability. What is it discussing?
Theological education.
What part of theological education? Be as specific as you can towards the perspective.
How to minister to those with disabilities.
Is it ministering?
See, that's what I had. Different aspects of ministering to people with disabilities, so I take it I'm way off on that.
No, you're not way off. You're just not, you're going broad focus. I want you to think exactly what he is writing about, not what you're inferring from it.
Sort of the degree to which theological schools are preparing their people to minister to or educate folks with disabilities.
Specifically including
Are
the
we-
seminary course itself opened to someone with disability as the primary focus.
I was gonna say specifically recruiting people with disabilities, so going for the minorities no matter what.
Yep.
Are we looking for those people to fill slots that do or don't exist, or that we want to create?
So it's not necessarily ministering to all people. It's thinking about putting butts in classrooms. It's thinking about that to artificially perhaps, but in important ways, because if a minister of God does not look like someone being ministered to in some way, shape, or form, there's no relatability, and you lose some of the authenticity. So if you're going to be the chaplain for the Burton Center, do you have to have a disability? No. Is there an implicit honesty that is more relatable, though, if you have trained someone with a disability to help the people there? At least as one point of entree to the gospel. Should that be the only minister? No. But that's a subtext of this that I really want you to wrestle with a little bit. Because this article is not telling you how to bring good news to all people. But the first statements almost sounded like it because that's what we take away, but we are reading into it. That's why this is an important article. Yes, I want to train more people with different disabilities to be ministers of the word so that they can more honestly. There was an ARP pastor from Greensboro, North Carolina, who at commencement one year said, you know, looking out at this congregation right now at commencement gives me hope. If only we had more people of Hispanic extraction and Asian extraction in this room, we'd start to look like the people of God and all the children of God. Because we have a wonderful balance in this seminary for people of European or of African descent. We don't do real well getting people of other descent in here. And all the children of God need ministering to. And that includes people with different disabilities. But be careful when you're reading things, because sometimes when we're teaching, we do this, that I was kind of forcing you guys to think here, of how do we extrapolate this? And that's a natural response. That's a good response, but sometimes it's taken too far.
So is this like we need to recruit people to serve God that have disabilities?
Sometimes we do. That's what the article is
We
saying.
need to give somebody a calling to serve Christ that has a
No,
disability.
we need to
rather
make
than
sure
all
that
these-
their access is being granted where they have a call. That we are listening for a call where we don't typically listen. It's not actively recruiting to fill a spot. It's not weird affirmative action.
Okay,
It is opening up access where access is otherwise typically denied.
Which is a really good distinction, because what Anthony says at one part of the book is,
Yep.
our, not necessarily by our biases, but by the culture that we are best able to serve, we may not necessarily be a place where, we may be able to serve 2 or 3 cultures really, really well.
Yeah.
But you will not find any church that is going to serve people of European, African, Asian, Hispanic, Bosnian, Martian descent all equally well.
Correct.
And so, but what you do want to do is make sure that you're not fencing out somebody's need where there is a legitimate opportunity for them to serve. So it's not contriving space, but
Excellent,
it's
yes.
making sure that you're not creating a road or maintaining.
We're
a
not
roadblock.
putting up stumbling blocks.
Or maintaining a stumbling block that we may have never
Yep.
seen that way.
But it is difficult because that means the discernment process for that individual is going to be harder. But who am I to deny Christ when he has called someone? But that is the issue here. It's not just an affirmative action thing. In the church,
it's being available,
it's being available.
being willing and
Yeah.
available.
Not being a stumbling block to others or being a roadblock to the Holy Spirit. Within the church is where we put up the most roadblocks to God.
So we need to be more proactive.
Or better listeners in different ways.
No, we've already covered the
All right. Now, this final article for this week. I want you to wrestle with this as it integrates with what we have been discussing this entire class. That's why I saved it for last. It seems like this would be the easiest starting point. But as an end point, what are the challenges in reality that this brings up after we've had all these discussions tonight?
Is this the Haney article, or is it the?
Yeah.
Yeah,
We read this one
decentralized.
last week, I
Was
think.
last week?
We read this last week?
I think so.
Yeah.
Okay. We just didn't talk about it last week?
I don't think so.
Right, but it was in the assignment for this week.
I thought it was in the assignment for this week.
Richie?
Haney,
Richie, that was Richie.
oh,
This was,
talking about,
Decentralized Theological Education in Europe is the title.
Yeah, the one I had was pedagogical challenges for Christian theology.
that's what I did mine on.
In a religious plural context was number 3 for this week.
mm,
This
Okay.
was number 4 from last week.
yeah.
Oh, okay, I apologize.
Mm.
I'm sure it still relates.
It still does relate. I was really proud of myself when I was putting this lecture together last week. So,
That's right, there were 2 Haneys, and I
Yeah.
remember that when I printed all of them off.
It makes it more complex. Everything we talked about with access and purpose and plan and trying to maintain a community and trying to create equal access for people of different backgrounds, abilities, etc., all becomes more difficult when you have this decentralization issue. Because even in some places, as Christianized as the Bible Belt, even just in the last 10 years, we've seen residential seminaries decline. Commuter mobile models for graduate theological education is becoming the norm. And so how do you take all this good scholarship about access and community and all these other things and still try to serve those good purposes without the benefit of having everybody right there
well put. What do you miss that we've talked about tonight as being really important? What do you miss with the decentralized theological education?
The community in a sense, the same way you miss community in a sense, you only ever interact with your friends on Facebook. Not that,
Pretend we put up a Facebook page for,
and there's a sense in which I think, we were able to relate to some people, our acquaintances, even maybe more effectively or regularly when there's a distance using things like the internet or social media. But there's something about face-to-face interaction as well, and not only that, but sharing life together. With students, my undergraduate experience has been very different than my graduate level experience because I've now been in two different schools in two different contexts, a commuter. And you don't go to the coffee shop after class and talk about life or the topics that you discuss, let alone how those two things interact. There's just not the same.
so what you just said, if I can rephrase it, is that you're missing the informal and non-formal elements of education. You're retaining only the formal. Which if you look through this again, that's a really important part of the work. What do you gain? So all the years that I taught family and community medicine, and DPR, doctor-patient relations, bringing them through the emergency room that first week of medical school, that was me. I got to make sure that those brand new little white lab coats they were wearing got blood or urine or feces or worse, much worse, all over it that first week of school, so that they were more confident that they knew what they were getting into. I don't write that into a syllabus, but it becomes an expectation for the people working in the emergency room to make sure that they are getting an experience of what life is really going to be like, not the pure aesthetics of a pure white lab coat. That they are thinking through, just as you have to think through what are those 2 o'clock bangs on the door because someone knows where you live, and they might literally have blood all over them, and you might have to do some CPR because that person has a heart attack in the middle of your sermon. Yeah, these are the realities of it.
And one thing that can be helpful, is something I think that was in the Sue article, where you try to get a lot of that formal education, the content aspect of it, handled outside of class, so that on rare occasions
Yep.
where you can be together, or there's a forum or whatever, the more decentralized, if it's
Yep.
infrequent meetings or some other way to interact, you can process the things at that point.
Yep. Notice this week's lecture as an example, or set sort of, well, it's a lecture course. Notice that until these last couple of slides, it wasn't on the reading. It was on stitching the reading together. It was on stuff not in the readings, but helps make the readings more sensical and allows for opportunities for you to sensitize yourselves to what are the issues that you don't yet have the vocabulary for within the field of education as a general rule as learners. The average seminarian does not. It's always fun when you get someone who already has an Ed D and they're coming in here for their MDiv and they're like, yeah, I'm gonna do this. That's my article. That doesn't always happen though, right? What if we are teaching though, and we are not thinking with this worldview I keep coming back to, that integrates the gospel above and beyond? What if we leave the gospel for those last couple slides, right? Instead of having it as the worldview through which everything is seen, implicit in every single slide. If you notice, there has not been one slide shown that we have not talked about the gospel. Every single one of them. We have. I've been keeping track. making sure. That's an aspect of Christian education in practice that we have to plan out well and think through and train ourselves to make sure I don't leave that slide until we have discussed a natural element of how the gospel fits in. A natural as opposed to an artificial construct that doesn't make sense to people. It doesn't feel right. So stop and think, is Christian education just education where we go, all right, let's start class, let's say Jesus, Jesus, Jesus. Okay, let's go on to our, whatever the work is, right? Have you ever been to a church that does that? Let's have a nice reading from the gospel. Usually it's going to be from the epistle, actually, not from one of the four gospels. And then there's a sermon that has nothing to do whatsoever with what was just read. There's some nodding going on here, good.
I appreciate it.
Well, that's one of the reasons why we have Christian Ed as a part of the curriculum. Because what you might miss in one course, you'll hear in another in a different way. That's the point of this, to get you to think through the multiplicity of modalities. How many different ways there are to skin that chicken. I don't want to skin a cat. I'd rather skin a chicken.
You pluck a chicken.
Now you skin it too.
You don't leave the skin on, it gets crispy.
Yeah, it depends.
Cats are nice, especially with brown mushroom gravy.
All right.
We're due west, get a couple different ways to skin a squirrel.
Let's not hand out our 410 gauges right now, which I might talk about in an EVC at some point, right? People don't always know that we shoot squirrels here in the